more importantly, when you get into discussions with people and you mention either you question the existence of viruses or you question whether vaccines have actually prevented any human or animal disease ever, the two examples that are always mentioned are smallpox, which we showed last week, and polio. Dr. Cowan, we wiped out polio with the polio vaccines. How can you say, A, it's not a virus, or vaccines don't work? That is one of the biggest lies about virology, and it's the lie that you hear over and over and over again. And so I'm going to play about a 10-minute clip from this movie that just goes over some of the points, and hopefully everybody will be inspired to watch the rest, where you'll see lots of charts and actual very clear evidence of what polio is. Because the other reason for doing this video is people, in my view, erroneously say that we need to be able to tell them what caused polio in order for them to be convinced it's not a virus. And again, as I've said over and over again, that is simply not logical, rational, or accurate. You don't need to know what makes rain or clouds form to know that it's not elephants flying in the air and pissing down on us. You can easily prove that that's not the case. There are no elephants up there, even if you have no idea about the complex reasons of how clouds form and then rain falls. If you have no idea about that, you still can be 100% sure it has nothing to do with pissing elephants. So to say that we have to know is that there's some other reason is completely illogical. But in this case, polio, it turns out we do know. And so here's what we know. I'll be back at the end of this. So when this whole thing got started, we're talking now late 1800s, basically Pasteur and Koch and a few other people said every disease has to be correlated with one microorganism. And at the time, before electron microscopes, they could only see, they only had a light microscope, so they could see bacteria. So they found certain diseases like anthrax, where they found a bacteria. Now, interestingly, they didn't find it in everybody with anthrax, which is odd, because if anthrax was caused by a bacteria, you would think everybody would have it. Number two, they could find a lot of people who had the bacteria in their tissues who were totally fine. Anyways, so they had a bunch of illnesses which they could see a bacteria, and then they had illnesses, and in particular polio, where they couldn't find a bacteria, right? No bacteria, they know they're sick, they seem to be happening in communities, therefore it must be some pathogen smaller than a bacteria which we can't see. That's the thinking. So they called it a virus, meaning that's the old Latin word for poison. So there was some smaller than a bacteria, we can't see it, and that must be what's causing all these people to be sick in situations where we can't find a bacteria. So how do we prove it? Well, we take tissue from somebody with polio and we grind it up, and sometimes they would filter it. So they would take the supernate and the liquid part, and then we expose it to different animals. And they tried about 20 different animals. And then you find something very interesting. The trouble with determining that polio was a virus was they couldn't find an animal model. In other words, they couldn't find an animal that got sick from the virus. Now think about that for a minute. So they get stuff from somebody with polio. They try guinea pigs and hamsters and monkeys and rats and mice and gerbils and everything. None of them got sick. So some people would say, that means the thing doesn't make you sick. What they said was, there's no animal model for that virus. And so there was no tissue model. They hadn't discovered how to make vero cells sick yet. There's no tissue model. There's no animal model. So how do we know that it's making anybody sick? Well, because a bunch of people in the same place get sick. So that must mean it's a virus. So then they said, well, we can try one more time. So they took a child who had polio. They took some of their spinal tissue, ground it up in some water, filtered it so that they got rid of the cellular stuff. So they have just basically ground up liquid diseased spinal cord, right? That's not a virus. That's a whole lot of things. And they got 2 monkeys. They drilled a hole in the monkey's brain, injected I don't know how much of this goop into the monkey's brain. One monkey died and the other got paralyzed. They hold the monkey up and say, see, we've transmitted the virus to the monkey. Now, as I've said, the only thing I can say for sure is that if you're a monkey and somebody wants to inject diseased spinal cord directly into your brain, your best bet is to run. Because it's a good chance that nothing good will come out of that. And in fact, there's such a thing as called brainstem herniation, which means if you inject stuff into your brain, the brainstem herniates down and gets stuck in the bony hole, and then you die. So you would think that if you're going to inject like a half a cup of diseased brains, spinal cord into somebody's brain, you would do a half a cup of saline or milk or something to see maybe it's because of the injection of stuff into a monkey's brain. But they didn't do that. They didn't do any controls. They just said that 1907 was the proof that polio is caused by a virus. And you read that and you think, what the heck? Like, that's not, that's just nuts.
They did these experiments where they had essentially a child who died of polio, and they took like the brain and spinal cord, or just the spinal cord. That's where polio affects the disease. It's actually, the name of the disease is poliomyelitis, which means that it affects a specific part of the spinal cord. And polio is just short for that. And so what they did is they took children who died of polio, and they took their spinal cord that was diseased, and they chopped it up in a blender, and they tried to give it to experimental animals to see if they could cause polio. And they gave it to them every which way. Like they shoved it down their nose or throat, they even injected it, and none of the animals got polio. So finally what they did was they actually took this chopped up spinal cord and they opened up the brain of some monkeys and put it directly in the brain. Well, if you put up dead, rotting tissue from an animal directly into the brain, it's going to cause some problems. And it did, and they basically said, based on that, here's your evidence that this thing causes polio.
So if you go to medical school, what you learn is they proved that polio was a virus. That's what you learn. Even, you don't even really learn that, but you just learn that it's a virus. And you assume that somebody, someday, must have shown that it was a virus. And nobody says, okay, by the way, could you show me the original study that showed this? Nobody said that. Everybody knows it's a virus. You don't ask, for evidence or proof. That is the proof. Once that becomes sort of the dogma, you can't say, I don't think this is a virus.
I'm an Orthodox doctor, and I always thought polio is a classic infectious disease, which is limited now by vaccination. But when we further dig in that problem, we found out that there was no purification of this virus and no animal model of the polio virus that causes disease in the animal. Instead, the assumption that polio is transmissible goes back to experiments from Landsteiner, but they did, like Gadusek, intracerebral inoculation. And that's really, for me, it's not a proof for a transmissible virus. That's, as we know now, it's an allergic reaction against foreign proteins when you inject foreign protein into the brain. Then you get acute allergic encephalitis.
Now, what they never looked at is that there was an invasive species brought over from Europe called the gypsy moth, and it was devastating because it was eating all the fruit trees when it came to the country. And they started using a compound called lead arsenate, which would kill this moth. But this was really the first time they used a chemical pesticide, and people didn't have experience or know what they were doing, and so they didn't take precautions, and they basically doused everything with this stuff. And they did this, of course, in the spring. And when did we see polio cases? Every summer. So what would happen is that this lead arsenate started getting sprayed on all of the fruit crops to prevent the moth from devastating them. Then when they started harvesting the summer fruit, like the strawberries in June, etc., the kids who are more sensitive to neurotoxins because they're developing and they're small, they would eat this fruit, get the lead arsenate, and some of them would be paralyzed if they got enough. And this happened in a seasonal pattern that exactly matched when they would apply the lead arsenate.
These communities that got polio were the ones that were being sprayed with lead arsenic. We know that lead arsenic is a specific neurotoxin for the anterior horn cells of the nervous system, exactly the part that's affected with polio.
In Massachusetts, I think, where there was a town where they had installed a couple of cotton mills, and below the cotton mills, there was a polio epidemic. So what happened to the cotton industry at the time? They were introducing carbon tetrachloride in order to dissolve the cottonseed oil out of the cottonseed, which is a chemical like DDT, basically. This is like 1908. And then also, when they did the review of this epidemic, they stated that this epidemic does not have the characteristics of an epidemic. There's no, you can't really trace one person to another as if it was a germ epidemic.
And basically this kept up, and at some point they switched from lead arsenate to DDT.
Okay, and you can go on, and hopefully you'll go on to watch the rest, and maybe somebody can put in the chat the link to the viraldelusion.com and how to get that. But one of the important things about that the polio is it's one of the most clear and well worked out situation where we already knew we have well worked out what actually causes the symptoms which are confused with what are called polio. So it has nothing to do with the virus. The getting rid of it had nothing to do with any vaccines. It had all to do with a change in the definition of the diagnosis and a change in the type and the amount and way pesticides are being used.